walks with me, and he tells me I am his own. And the joy we share as we tarry there, no earth has ever known.
The Gospel reading is taken from Mark 3, verses 1 to 6. Again he entered the synagogue, and a man was there who had a withered hand. They watched him to see whether he would cure him on the Sabbath, so that they might accuse him. And he said to the man who had the withered hand, "Come forward." Then he said to them, "Is it lawful to do good or to do harm on the Sabbath? To save life or to kill?" But they were silent. He looked around at them with anger. He was grieved at their hardness of heart and said to the man, "Stretch out your hand." He stretched it out, and his hand was restored. The Pharisees went out immediately, conspired with the Herodians against him, how to destroy him.
The events of Maundy Thursday. Jesus' Last Supper with his disciples, his betrayal, his anguished prayer in Gethsemane, his arrest. These have all led to this day. Good Friday, the day of crucifixion and death. We turn together once more to this story, knowing that we too are part of Christ's journey. Let us, in this day, knowing that God is here amidst the darkness, enter once more into Christ's final day.
Mark 15, 1 through 47. Early in the morning, the chief priest met hurriedly with the elders, the teachers of the law, and the whole council, and made their plans. They put Jesus in chains, led him away, and handed him over to Pilate. Pilate questioned him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" Jesus answered him, "So you say." The chief priests were accusing Jesus of many things, so Pilate questioned him again. "Aren't you going to answer? Listen to all their accusations." Again, Jesus refused to say a word, and Pilate was amazed. At every Passover festival, Pilate, as in the habit of setting free any one prisoner the people asked for. At that time, a man named Barabbas was in prison with the rebels who had committed murder in the riot. When the crowd gathered and began to ask Pilate for the usual favor, he asked them, "Do you want me to set free for you the king of the Jews?" He knew very well that the chief priests had handed Jesus over to him because they were jealous. But the chief priests stirred up the crowd to ask instead for Pilate to set Barabbas free for them. Pilate spoke again to the crowd. "What do you want me to do with the king of the Jews?" They shouted back, "Crucify him." "But what crime has he committed?" Pilate asked. They shouted all the louder, "Crucify him." Pilate wanted to please the crowd, so he set Barabbas free for them. And then he had Jesus whipped and handed him over to be crucified. The soldiers took Jesus inside to the courtyard of the governor's palace and called together the rest of the company. They put purple robes on Jesus, made a crown of thorny branches, and put it on his head. Then they began to salute him, "Long live the King of the Jews." They beat him over the head with a stick, spat on him, fell on their knees, and bowed down to him. When they had finished mocking him, they took off the purple robe and put his own clothes back on him. Then they led him out to crucify him.
And we continue with Mark 15. On the way, they met a man named Simon, who was coming into the city from the country, and soldiers forced him to carry Jesus' cross. They took Jesus to a place called Golgotha, which means the place of the skull. There they tried to give him wine mixed with a drug called myrrh, but Jesus would not drink it. Then they crucified him and divided his clothes among themselves, throwing dice to see who would get which piece of clothing. It was 9 o'clock in the morning when they crucified him. The notice of the accusation against him said, "The King of the Jews." They also crucified 2 bandits with Jesus, one on his right, the other on his left. People passing by shook their heads and hurled insults at Jesus. "Aha! You were going to tear down the temple and build it up again in 3 days. Now come down from the cross and save yourself." In the same way, the chief priests and the teachers of the law jeered at Jesus, saying to each other, "He saved others, but he cannot save himself. Let us see the Messiah, the King of Israel, come down from the cross now, and we will believe in him." And the 2 who were crucified with Jesus insulted him also. At noon, the whole country was covered with darkness, which lasted for 3 hours. At 3 o'clock, Jesus cried out with a loud shout, my God, why did you abandon me?" Some of the people there heard him and said, "Listen, he is calling for Elijah." One of them ran up with a sponge, soaked it in cheap wine, and put it on the end of a stick. Then he held it up to Jesus' lip and said, "Wait, let us see if Elijah is coming to bring him down from the cross." With a loud cry, Jesus died. The curtain hanging in the temple was torn in 2 from top to bottom. The army officer who was standing there in front of the cross saw how Jesus had died. "This man was really the Son of God," he said. Some women were there looking on from a distance. Among them were Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of the younger James, and of Joseph and Salome. They had followed Jesus while he was in Galilee and had helped him. Many other women who had come to Jerusalem with him were there also.
And continuing with Mark 15. It was towards evening when Joseph of Arimathea arrived. He was a respected member of the council who was waiting for the coming of the King of God. It was preparation day, that is, the day before the Sabbath. So Joseph went boldly into the presence of Pilate and asked him for the body of Jesus. Pilate was surprised to hear that Jesus was already dead. He called the armed officer and asked him if Jesus had been dead a long time. After hearing the officer's report, Pilate told Joseph he could have the body. Joseph bought a linen sheet, took the body down, wrapped it in the sheet, and placed it in a tomb which had been dug out of solid rock. Then he rolled a large stone across the entrance to the tomb. Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of Joseph, were watching and saw where the body of Jesus was placed.
Jesus would have known that he was going to die. As fully God, he would have, of course, known that. But as also fully human, he had to know that too. From the first time he healed on the Sabbath, angering the authorities, to all the times he criticized the wealthy and the powerful, to the ways he included and loved all the people who weren't supposed to be included and loved, all the sinners of the world who were deemed unclean and thus unworthy of dignity and worth. Jesus preached and lived a radical gospel of love and belonging. In doing so, he revealed most fully what God's kingdom looks like on earth. In doing so, he also gained many enemies who had a vested interest in maintaining the social status quo. That Jesus' ministry would almost inevitably lead to his death begins to come to a head on Maundy Thursday. Judas, one of his closest friends, has betrayed him to his enemies. After the Last Supper with his disciples, Jesus goes to Gethsemane to pray, knowing that his arrest is at hand. In grief and in agitation, he begins to pray. My Father, if it is possible, let this cup pass from me. Yet not what I want, but what you want. This is a pivotal moment. At this moment, Jesus, as fully God, could call on God's angels to save him. Jesus, as also fully human, could simply run away, hightail it out of Gethsemane and Jerusalem, lay low for a while in some far-flung village, look for work as a carpenter. But he doesn't. He doesn't run away. He doesn't call on God to save him. He stays and he faces what is to come. He is grieved. He is agitated. He is afraid. And he stays. Good Friday is a dark day. It reveals some of the worst that human beings are capable of. And yet Good Friday is not the day where the forces of goodness and hope and love are apparently defeated. On the contrary, this is the day when those forces are at their strongest. Jesus does not need to go through this time of anguish and pain and horrible death. But throughout his ministry, it is love that compels him to bring hope, dignity, and belonging to all who need it. And it is that love that compels him to continue his ministry even unto the cross. Jesus is betrayed, he is arrested and deserted, Jesus is mocked, spat upon, and beaten. He's nailed to a cross and left to die a slow, agonizing death in public. If you want to know if God understands any physical or emotional anguish you experience in this life, the answer is yes. God understands. If you want to know how much God loves each one of us, the answer is enough to die on a cross. The crucifixion is not about atonement for sins. It's not about God demanding a sufficient sacrifice so that we can be made right with God. The crucifixion is rather aboundingly and fully about love. It is about when you love someone so much that you would go through anything for them. That is God's love for us. That Christ would rather die on a cross than stop his ministry of love. On this Good Friday, as we mark the grief, the horror, the depth of injustice of Christ's crucifixion and death, we also mark the full revelation of God's love for us. A love that, in spite of fear, in spite of grief and pain, will always go to the cross for us. That is the God of our faith. That is the gospel we proclaim. That is the depth of God's love.